Chapter 5, the dynamic cell. So we're going to talk today in this lecture about how the cell is dynamic in terms of how it uses different, how it's able to actually convert energy, use different energy, and then how that energy can then be used to kind of have different metabolic reactions. So how do we go about catalyzing different metabolic pathways? And lastly, how do we actually, once we catalyze these reactions and we get these different products, how do we actually transport the products in and out of the cell? So we'll talk a little bit more about cell transport as well. So let's start off with what is energy. So what is energy? What do you guys think of when you think of energy? Right? Sometimes we're like, oh, I'm so low energy. So we're kind of thinking like, I don't want to do any work today because I'm so low energy, versus like, whoa, I'm so energized. I drink all that coffee and I'm so energized, right? You're like ready to like go out there and get stuff done because you're so energized. So we can kind of think of energy as basically the capacity to do work. Now, of course, in biology, we kind of think of it a little bit more with regards to different chemical reactions and such, but still, it's the capacity to do work is kind of what we want to focus on. And so, in our biosphere, the sun is the main source of energy. We've kind of talked about that before, about how the sun is able to, release a lot of heat, and then this thermal energy from the sun is able to be used by different plant cells. That the plant cells can then take that sun, and through photosynthesis, it can make a lot of different chemical molecules that it can then be stored and used later, right? So we think of starch as one of the ways that a plant can actually store chemical energy. And so with that being said, there are two basic forms of energy that we can think of. First being potential energy, which is stored energy. So if we go back to our sample here, we can think of the different starch molecule that exists inside of the plant when it converted that sun energy into starch. The next is kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. So this we can actually think of as the heat that is leaving the sun and allowing it to be converted. We convert it into heat that's being able to convert into starch. So let's kind of look at this picture right here and kind of compare the difference between potential energy and kinetic energy. So we kind of already discussed it, but here's the sun, right? So this is our original energy source right here. And the sun is releasing a lot of thermal energy as heat. And this heat, which at this time is kinetic energy, is going to be used by these plants. These plants that's going to do photosynthesis is going to take the kinetic energy as well as carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to convert that kinetic energy into starch, right? I'm going to just put S for starch. It's going to convert that into starch. Starch is potential energy, so we're going to store all the starch in the plant. This starch can then be used as kinetic energy, right? It has the potential to be used as kinetic energy when the plant needs to do some work. So the plants can convert that starch and go through a whole process, which we'll discuss later on in other chapters. It's going to convert it basically into ATP molecules. And we kind of talked about ATP molecules when we talked about nucleic acid. Remember that we can use ATP molecules for our energy source. So it's going to convert that starch into ATP. So now we have another sense of stored energy. So now we have potential energy again. That ATP can then be used to be coupled along with different type of reactions and getting us to be able to do work by doing the reaction. So now we're going back to kinetic energy again. Additionally, we will lose some of the energy as heat that gets returned back into the atmosphere. So we'll lose some of that heat when we do chemical reaction. So some of that heat is going to be released back into the environment, right? For us to use, that gets used later on for different things. But we can look at this guy and this guy. So here, this guy is eating, I'm going to assume he's eating an apple. He's consuming this potential energy that he can then convert into ATP. And then that ATP is going to allow him to go for a walk. And when he goes for a walk, that becomes kinetic energy again. And some of that will also be released as heat. So you can think of this as when you're sweating, and this will also be kinetic energy. Okay, so let's go to this question right here. What type of energy does a skier at the top of the mountain versus on the ski run has? So when we compare this guy right here, he has potential energy, right? He's not moving, he's not quite doing work, he's just on top of the hill. He's storing off his energy. His energy would then be used when he goes down the hill as kinetic energy. So how do we go about measuring energy? We can measure energy when we consume food. We can think of energy. We tend to think of energy as calorie, right? So we tend to think of like, how do we acquire energy? Well, we consume the energy, and that energy has a certain quantity that's associated with it, which is measuring calorie. So calorie is the amount of energy that it takes to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 Celsius. So you can think of it, the energy, the heat energy that it takes to raise that water, 1 gram of water by 1 Celsius. And when we think of calorie with regards to the food that we consume, don't forget that 1 calorie for the food that we consume here, so right here it says it's 142 calories. It's not actually 142 calories. We actually measure our food that we consume. The food value is 1 calorie is actually equivalent to 1,000 calories. So I know it says 1 calorie, but it's actually 1,000 calorie or 1 kilocalorie. Okay, my work time blended. Let me drop that. 1 kilocalorie, okay? So, you probably have heard of negative calorie food, right? My father-in-law used to joke that he doesn't like eating crab, for example, because it takes so much energy to break the crab and try to get that meat out of the crab that he's losing more calories than he actually consumes. So let's think of this question here. Does chewing and swallowing celery actually burn more calories than you actually get from the celery? What do you guys think? Is it true or false? So in a study, they found that raw celery, a certain amount of raw celery has 53 calories. One celery has about 4 calories. So this person is actually consuming quite a bit of celery. So that subject consumed 53 calories worth of celery. When they measure how much calorie the subject was burning from chewing and swallowing, digesting celery, it came out to be 72 calories. So the answer here is true, that it actually takes more calories, or you're burning more calories, releasing a calorie, to chew and swallow the celery than you actually get from consuming the celery. So how did that happen? Like, where did we lose that energy? Like, how is it that we're actually able to burn more calories than the amount of calories in the celery? It's actually from the digestion. It takes a lot of work. So it's not just specifically chewing. The chewing, that motion, the mechanical energy right there you are burning some calories, but most of the calories that you're burning is actually from the digesting and the breaking down that celery once it actually goes through the digestive tract. So we think about energy with regards to, converting it back and forth, doing kinetic and potential, where we get energy and stuff. So there's 2 laws of thermodynamics that we should think of when we think about energy. The first law is this conservation of energy. That is, energy is neither created nor destroyed. What do we mean by this? Well, we saw in that picture how when we go from the sun to like moving the energy, that energy isn't really created, right? Yeah, the plant is creating starch, but it's not actually creating energy. It's converting that thermal energy into potential energy. So it's converting sun energy into starch, right? Via thermal energy, water, and carbon dioxide, right? It's able to convert that energy into starch. But that starch is then going to be used by the plant to be able to grow and survive, right? So that energy is going to be converted, that starch is going to be converted to energy they can use. We don't just make energy ourselves, we actually consume energy. So that's potential energy we're consuming, yada, 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 right? So energy is being transferred from one form to another. We're going from potential energy to kinetic energy. So that's the first law of thermodynamic, is that energy is neither created or destroyed. We're just transferring from one form to another. The second law of thermodynamic is that energy cannot be changed from one form to another without a loss of usable energy. What do you guys think usable energy is? What did we say that when we're doing a reaction, such as walking? So when you're walking, let's use that as an example. When you're walking, you're using that energy to be able to do the motion. But where are we losing energy? Where does that energy come from? Well, we've sped up our pace a little bit, right? You can definitely tell. You start sweating a little bit, you start breathing a little bit harder. So this energy, some of the energy, despite in addition to being used to go for that walk, is also being used to convert as heat. So we're going to lose some of it as heat. Can we use that heat? What do you guys think? Can you use the heat that's being released? Can that be transferred back into potential energy? Remember that lady that was eating the soup? What do you think was happening there? That heat was used to warm up the soup, and then she's going to eat the soup, and that soup right there has potential energy. So that thermal energy was used to actually raise the temperature of that soup, right? Where's another example of thermal energy that we've been looking at? How about the sun? The sun is also a thermal energy that we've been looking at, right? So the sun also has a lot of energy that the sun being the sun is going to constantly lose some of that heat that it is forming, and that thermal heat can now be used by the plants to do photosynthesis. So that thermal energy again can be used to convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose that then gets stored as starch. So I kind of want to bring up with this term of entropy right here. So this entropy is the measure of the relative amount of disorganization. So in terms of energy, we can think of entropy always kind of increases, because with every energy transformation, we're increasing the amount of disorganization and disorder. So in order to maintain or bring about order, we have to actually add energy. So you can think of this as like when the sun is providing energy to the plant, it's taking glucose from a more disorganized, so water and carbon dioxide is a little more disorganized, and it's going to convert that disorganization into an organized form, which is glucose. But in order to actually do that conversion of entropy and trying to bring order about, we have to add energy. So that energy is coming from the sun. So that thermal energy is coming from the sun. And overall, entropy is always kind of increasing in this world, because every kind of reaction is always kind of causing a little bit of disorder. And in order for us to get some order, we actually have to add some energy. But in general, energy, the energy transformation is always going to lead to an increase in entropy, and it's always kind of increasing. All right, so now this energy that we are getting, that we're converting into glucose, is going to be stored in plants as starch, in humans as glycogen, and then we're going to eventually, so at this point, we can't really use glucose directly as our energy source. So while we might say that, we want to consume, I don't know, let's say a burger, that we want to consume the burger to get some energy, we actually can't use that burger right away as energy. So we actually have to convert it into a currency that cells can actually use. And this currency is ATP, acetylene triphosphate, right? So this is one of the nucleotides, and it has 3 phosphate groups. So you can see over here, these 3 phosphate group right here. And these 3 phosphate groups are kind of unstable. There's a lot of energy. You can see right here, displayed by these red, that there's a lot of energy between those phosphate bonds. And so the ATP can easily lose one diphosphate, and when it loses that phosphate and become adenine triphosphate, it will have some energy that gets lost as it's losing that phosphate, and that energy can be coupled with another reaction to allow the reaction to occur. So what drives most reaction or activities in a cell is this conversion of ATP into ADP. Right? So ATP to ADP is what drives most reactions in the cell. And it's this continuous cycle of breakdown regeneration, meaning that our cells are always trying to take ADP and convert it back to ATP. So that's when we take ADP and we're using the glucose in order to make some ADP into ATP by adding that phosphate. There's a whole cycle. We'll talk about that later. But we're taking the ADP, making to ATP. Once we have this reserve of ATP, we then convert the ATP back to ADP when we do different chemical reactions. So this is known as the ATP-ADP cycle, because we're always converting ATP to ADP and then back, right? We're always doing ATP to ADP, and then we need more energy, so then we convert ADP back to ATP, and then we need to use the energy to do certain reactions, so we go from ATP back to ADP. Okay, so you have this cycle here as we take the glucose and we make ATP, and then ATP can then be used to do whatever reactions, to be coupled, to do whatever reaction we need. Don't forget that some of this energy is going to be lost as heat, so we never want to forget that reactions sometimes will lose that usable amount of energy, which is the heat. But for the most part, reactions are going to couple with ATP, and then you end up with this ADP. This ADP will reform when we undergo different type of respiration, cellular respiration, in order to convert it back to ATP. So what are some reactions that you can think of that releases energy versus those that require energy? So based on what we've talked about so far, can you give an example of both? There's a lot of reactions that can release energy, right? So basically when we do work, we're releasing energy. So this could be the breaking down and rearrangement of different molecules, right? So breaking the ATP down to ADP, that's going to be an example of a reaction that releases energy. When we are working out and we're contracting our muscles and doing all that lifting, the myosin, which are the molecules that are found in muscles, in order for to allow your muscle to contract, it's going to be combined with ATP to be able to do that reaction, and then it's going to release ADP and phosphate. Moving things in and out of the cell, we'll see that when we look at energy transport, can sometimes require energy in order to move some molecules in and out of the cell. We actually need energy. So there's a lot of reactions that can release energy. What about one that requires energy? Can you think of one that requires energy? So we talked already about how the sun has thermal energy, right? So going back to this, thermal energy, and that thermal energy can now be used by the leaf. So the leaf, in order to do photosynthesis, is going to require energy, right? So to do photosynthesis, in order to make glucose molecule, we're going to actually require energy. So this is an example of a reaction that requires energy, and it gets that energy source from the sun. So let's look at mitochondria and chloroplast one more time and just kind of reiterate that flow of energy, right? So sun up here is going to have heat, and that heat is going to be able to be used by plant cells, by the plant cell's chloroplast, and in that chloroplast, it's going to convert that solar energy along with carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to convert that into glucose molecule, and that glucose molecule can be stored starch, and that starch can then be used later on in order to actually do cellular respiration. So chloroplast can do the photosynthesis section of this energy flow, But that energy, once it has the starch, we can actually transfer energy over to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria, so this will be true in photosynthesizing organisms as well as in animals. So for us, for example, we also use mitochondria. We have a lot of these mitochondria, which are organelles, that's going to allow us through cellular respiration, so through this method, it's going to allow us to break down the carbohydrates, so either our starch or our glycogen, depending on what type of organism you are. And it's going to take the carbohydrate, it's going to break it down, and it's going to use the energy that's released when it breaks down in order to make ATP. And so we'll cover this in a little more detail later on when we talk a little more about cellular respiration. But you can see the flow of energy where we start from the sun, converting into some sort of potential energy. That potential energy gets moved over and gets converted into kinetic energy, right? It gets to do some work here. And then the ATP becomes another potential energy molecule. And that potential energy is going to be used to be coupled with different reactions in order to do different work, right? So different type of work. All right. Let's move on to our next section in the next video. We'll be talking about metabolic pathways.